Unproven claims of U.S.-funded Ukraine bioweapons lab spread online. So this is a fact check. So we've showed you how the fact checkers are almost always wrong because they're funded by people who want you to think they're fact checking, but they also have a bias, and it's usually corporate. So here's another fact check, factcheck.org. We've shown you where they get their money. Social media posts misrepresent U.S.-Ukraine threat reduction program. Okay. Russia is targeting U.S. biological weapon labs in Ukraine invasion. That's from PolitiFact. And that's from the guy who did a bogus fact check on our show about coronavirus. That's that incel guy I showed you before. I'm not going to mention his name, but it's the same guy, and he's getting this wrong too. So they're saying that there's no false claims of U.S. biowarfare labs in Ukraine. How could anyone believe such nonsense? The next thing you're going to tell me is that natural immunity is real. So anyway, so here we go. Here's Marco Rubio, and he's interviewing Victoria Nuland, who is Undersecretary of State taking care of Ukraine right now. And here's what she says.
Does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces should they approach.
I'm sure you're aware that the Russian propaganda groups are already putting out there all kinds of information about how they've...
Now, I just want to just let everybody know what just happened. Is that she just contradicted their official position, and Marco Rubio was stunned that she answered honestly. Now, there's lots of speculation why she told the truth that they actually have bioweapons in Ukraine, but that's a big deal that she did that, okay? All right, now she goes on to do this.
Covered a plot by the Ukrainians to release biological weapons in the country and with NATO's coordination. If there's a biological or chemical weapon incident or attack inside of Ukraine, is there any doubt in your mind that 100% it would be the Russians that would be behind it?
Is there any doubt in your? Is there any doubt in your? There's doubt in my mind that you just put there literally 2 seconds ago. That's what he's saying. Okay.
There is no doubt in my mind, Senator, and it is classic Russian technique to blame on the other guy what they're planning to do themselves.
And only the Russians do that. No one else does that. Just the Russians. Certainly, we don't do that. So I just want to, Glenn, you tweeted out. You said whatever else is true, we should know what these so-called biological research facilities in Ukraine are. Claims that they are benign and common are negated by Nuland's grave concern about the materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces. So, by the way, for tweeting that out, you got this guy, Peter Jukes, called you a Russian. Just for tweeting out that video of her admitting that, which is a big deal. In fact, it stunned Marco Rubio to the fact where he had to break in and with some propaganda. It's nonstop Russian propaganda from Glenn Greenwald while Putin bombs maternity hospitals. Oh, my God. Okay, so just to let you know. So I just want to know, what the official State Department, the Kremlin's allegations of a chemical and biological weapon laboratory. So that guy, Ned Price, who we showed you before, he's the biggest tool ever. He got owned. The United States does not own or operate any chemical or biological laboratories in Ukraine. It is in full compliance with the obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and Biological Weapons Convention, and it does not develop or possess such weapons anywhere. It is Russia that has active chemical and biological weapon programs and is in violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. So then why do they give a shit about Russia getting a hold of those weapons? By the way, the WHO says it advised Ukraine to destroy pathogens in health labs to prevent disease spread. That's from March 11th. Look at that. And here's one more. You say reporting on admissions by the U.S. Officials testifying under oath before the Senate is now Russian propaganda, says drooling McCarthy. I'd like this. So we already showed you that. So let me just get to you wrote a Substack about this, and I just want to get a couple paragraphs out of it, and then we'll get into it. You say any attempt to claim that Ukraine's biological facilities are just benign and standard medical labs is negated by Nuland's explicitly grave concern that Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of those facilities, and that the U.S. government therefore is, right this minute, working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces. The only reason to be quite concerned about these biological research facilities falling into Russian hands is if they contain sophisticated materials that Russian scientists have not yet developed on their own and which could be used for nefarious purposes, i.e., either advanced biological weapons or dual-use research that has the potential to be weaponized. What is in those Ukraine biological labs that make them so worrisome and dangerous? And has Ukraine, not exactly known for being a great power with advanced biological research, had the assistance of any other countries in developing those dangerous substances? Is American assistance confined to what Nuland described at the hearing, working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces? Or did the U.S. assistance extend to the construction and development of the biological research facilities themselves? So let me bring in Glenn Greenwald, who wrote this, and there's more we'll show you, but this is being not reported correctly again, and people are downplaying her admission. Would you like to talk about it?
Sure. So I do think it's worth beginning with the behavior of the U.S. corporate media and also the so-called fact checkers who use that term for themselves, that self-glorifying,
yes,
elevating term to make you think that they're not just ordinary columnists or reporters or journalists who you rightly come to despise and distrust. Instead, they occupy this like more elevated, neutral level. They float above everything. They just simply decree what is true and false. That's all they're there to do, is just the facts, ma'am. It's the biggest fraud and scam ever. Many of these groups, as Jimmy said, are funded by the same small handful of billionaires, or they're tied to Western intelligence agencies, or they're just the same kind of journalists who you've already learned to hate in the newsrooms, who are now rebranding themselves as fact checkers so that you think there's something better. Now, this is what happened that I find so revealing, is this claim that there were seriously threatening biological and chemical weapons programs or labs in Ukraine is one that had been made for weeks, at least 2 weeks, by both the Russian government and the Chinese government. The Russian government said that in their invasion into Ukraine, they found documents and other materials in these labs proving that it was the U.S. that was aiding the Ukrainians in the development of these pathogens. And the Chinese said, basically confirming what the Russians said, that they had intelligence and other confirming data that show that the United States has many of these labs all over the world, and I think at least 14, maybe 20 of them in Ukraine. Now, I had heard the Russians and the Chinese saying this, but I didn't report on it. I didn't talk about it. I didn't go and write about it because I don't trust the unproven assertions of the Russian and Chinese governments any more than I trust the unproven assertions of the United States government. I need to see evidence for something before I believe a government and what they're saying. And they weren't providing evidence. They were simply asserting these claims. I didn't start getting interested in this until the Queen Neocon, the imperial overlord of Ukraine, who's been running that country since she picked the president or the prime minister in 2014 in a leaked audio, went to the Senate, and to Marco Rubio's shock, he asked her, he said, I only have a minute. He asked her, does Ukraine have biological and chemical weapons? Obviously expecting her very quickly to say, no, of course not, Senator, in order to debunk the Russian and Chinese claims, even though that wouldn't debunk them. It's just a neocon liar saying it, but they would use that to say, oh, look, it was debunked. We denied it. To everyone's shock, most particularly Marco Rubio, she didn't deny it. She remembered, she was asked, does Ukraine have biological and chemical weapons? She did not say no. She said they have biological research facilities that are dangerous enough that we're very concerned they would fall into Russian hands. That's when I got interested and said, oh, I'd like to know what's in these biological research facilities, given that, if you look at that Reuters article from today as well about the World Health Organization's warnings, it says in there that the United States is funding some of these programs. And again, they don't know what these programs entail. But what I discovered when I went to go write about it was that over the course of these 2 weeks, when there was no evidence presented by anyone, when I was staying away from it because I couldn't discern the truth, no one else could either, there was at least a half a dozen fact checkers in the United States who published articles, you just showed them, labeling this claim, not without evidence, which totally would have been valid, but outright false. They said it was a lie, a fake conspiracy theory circulated by QAnon that the Russians and Chinese are peddling as disinformation. Jimmy, they have no idea whether that's true. How could they possibly know that there are no biological and chemical weapons labs in Ukraine? All they know is that the CIA and the Pentagon told them they weren't there. But they don't know whether or not that's true to come out and say that it's false. Today, in the New York Times, one of the feature articles about Ukraine was a article by Edward Wong, basically saying in the first paragraph, Russia and China are disseminating a lie. They're falsely claiming as a disinformation campaign that Ukraine has biological and chemical weapons labs in Ukraine. The United States is helping them maintain and help them build. Edward Wong has no idea whether that's false or not. He then went on for multiple paragraphs saying this is a lie. The U.S. government said it was a lie. Therefore, we know it is because the U.S. government never lies. Just the Russian and Chinese do. That's the mindset of a modern day journalist. Pretty much a requirement to work at these outlets is to think that way. And then he went on to say that there were people, unfortunately, in the West who were disseminating Russian and Chinese propaganda for them. He mentioned Tucker Carlson, myself, and Al Weiwei, who is a dissident of China, not someone who serves the CCP, but is a dissident in the West. He is an artist and a digital artist, and he protests the Chinese government. But he was saying, he also was retweeting stuff and suggesting that there are good grounds to believe that those are there. So what you have here is the US government doing the same thing they did in the run-up to the Iraq War, which is explicitly treating US government denials as tantamount to the unquestioned truth. But in this case, they're not only doing that, but they're demanding that everybody treat that as true. That once the Pentagon and the CIA says that it's not there, that's the end of the story. And the only people for whom that's not the end of the story, who continue to question it or write about it, are, by definition, are Kremlin propagandists. It's so toxic and menacing what they're doing.
It's, but you know, again, this is what happens when you do 5 years nonstop of Russiagating, getting people to just absorb into them by osmosis that Russia is this evil empire, Putin is a special brand of evil, and that everything they do is evil. And so if eventually we're going to have to go to war with them, we're going to have to go to war with them. And now people are endorsing this, right? We got to go protect the people of Ukraine. So this is, again, this is another, and this is all part of that Russiagate. So of course, if you tell the truth, just when you told the truth about Russiagate, they called you a Putin puppet. Now, if you tell the truth about Ukraine and the Ukraine war, they call you a Putin puppet. And that's just how it works. That's neoliberal shit lib 101. Neocon, it's the military-industrial complex.
It united these yes. parties. The two parties are completely in lockstep, like they haven't been since 9/11. It absolutely united neoliberals and neoconservatives, and even like these more traditional Republican conservatives who were flirting for a while with a kind of anti-imperialism under Trump, who've now completely, the members of Congress who are Republicans, they're almost entirely on board with the Democratic Party's view of this war. And if anything, they're actually criticizing Biden for not being sufficiently confrontational, for not being more confrontational. Now, one thing when you mention Russiagate, because first of all, look how utterly these U.S. officials are when they talk to the public, how much contempt they have for your intelligence. Look at what Victoria Nuland said in that second part of that answer when Marco Rubio tried getting her to say, but if there's, despite what you just very unwisely and unfortunately admitted, very uncharacteristic for you, you told the truth, despite what you just confessed to, you still agree with me, right? That if there's a chemical or biological weapon attack in Ukraine, it's 100% definite that it's Russia. And she said, yeah, of course. And this is classic Russian technique, blaming the other guy for what you're about to do. Now, it's so funny. This is what they always do. They take extremely common human behaviors, like blaming the other guy for what you're about to do. That's just called projection. Like it's been discussed, in Freudian psychology by Jung, by Anna Freud, by modern day psychologists for centuries, that this is a very common human behavior, that you are about, you're going to do something, you are inclined to do something, and instead of admitting that you're going to do it, you blame it on it's not something Russia invented in like some secret lab. It's not like a specialized Soviet invention that only the Russian mind is. That's everybody does that every day. The other thing, they say the same thing, like whataboutism. Like, whataboutism is like a special Soviet technique. Whataboutism is nothing more than if somebody accuses you of doing something and condemns you for it, you say to them, well, you do the same thing as you're condemning me for. Who are you to say that? That happens every day in like marital fights for hundreds of years. That's been in international relations. But they'll be like, no, whataboutism? It's like this very nefarious and sinister doctrine that Soviet scientists cooked up in this like secret lab that now the Russians have inherited. They're always trying to make the Russians seem like almost subhuman. And it's like a way of constantly getting you to believe that they're this grave and threat. And it didn't just start with the Russian invasion of Ukraine 3 weeks ago. It, as you said, was the centerpiece of Russiagate. And that's just the part I want to quickly highlight is that, you know, I was on your show many times, a lot of other shows as well. I know you were too, mocking and ridiculing and arguing against Russiagate. And part of the objection that we had was, of course, that they had concocted this insane conspiracy theory that never had any evidence. The idea that, you know, Putin had taken control of the United States because he had sexual and financial and personal blackmail leverage over Trump, just like insane conspiracy theories for which there was no evidence, as Rob. So it was disturbing that the CIA had concocted, in partnership with the corporate media, a false conspiracy theory to interfere in our domestic politics and sabotage. And it's like that was part of it, the domestic angle. But part was how the geopolitical project that Russiagate was. It was always designed first and foremost to retrain Americans to once again view Moscow and Russia as this unique and grave threat, like the for 5 or 6 decades to the great benefit of the U.S. military-industrial complex during the Cold War. It already was a kind of embedded framework in our brains that Russia is the evil empire. It's something we're trained over generations to believe, and it rejuvenated that. And so you'd have like British and American generals going before the Congress and asking for increases on the already bloated defense budget. And they would say, well, we need it to confront the Russian threat. Every Western problem got blamed on Russia, not just the election of Donald Trump and the defeat of Hillary Clinton in 2016, but Brexit, the rise of far-right parties all throughout the West. Even here in Brazil, the center left is suggesting that Russia might hack into the 2022 election and help reelect Bolsonaro and corruptly defeat Lula. It's everywhere. And so liberals, American liberals, have been feeding on this steady diet of complete and utter hatred and contempt for Putin, for Russia, and for Russians that now you're seeing explode onto the scene. And it completely contaminated the ability of the United States and Russia, the two leading nuclear superpowers, to have any dialogue with one another. They made it so that any attempt on the part of U.S. officials to have diplomacy or dialogue with Russian diplomats or officials was viewed as inherently suspect, if not criminal. That's what they prosecuted Michael Flynn for. They tried to prosecute Jeff Sessions for. Just meeting with and speaking with Russian officials. So the climate is just one of pure animosity between the two capitals.
So, Glenn, why would you repeat Russian propaganda from Russia just because Victoria Nuland admitted it was real?
It's like we're at that point pretty much. Like if the Russian government says anything, like for example, there's some pretty substantial and dangerous neo-Nazi militias in Ukraine. Something that the Western press has been talking about for at least a decade, like concerned about, warning about. But if you say that now, you'll immediately get accused of spreading Russian propaganda. Why? Because the Russian government says it as well. So it's like the opposite game. Like
Yes.
Whatever the Russian government says, you're not allowed to say. You have to affirm the opposite, even if what the Russian government is saying is true. Doesn't mean you think the invasion is justified. Doesn't mean you don't think the bombardment is immoral or unjustified. You're just simply acknowledging this fact that exists. And as long as the Russian government is also asserting this fact, you're automatically a Russian agent by virtue of the fact that you're recognizing it.
I just think it's amazing that when she admitted that they had the biolabs and then immediately afterwards said, well, we're worried about Russia getting a hold of them. And so if there isn't some nefarious stuff happening in those labs, why would you care if Russia got a hold? No, they're just working on things that'll help people and cure their health. We don't want Russia to also be able to help people and cure their health. That would be horrible. Is that what they're saying, Glenn?
Well, I mean, they've kind of had these shifting defenses because they obviously didn't anticipate she was going to go and blab her mouth about these things and didn't have an
Yes.
answer, on the ready. So the first thing they said was, no. She was just referring to this very noble and heroic program instituted by the United States Senate under, those bipartisan centrist heroes, Sam Nunn of Georgia and Richard Lugar of Indiana, was kind of an old wise men of Washington who had a program to secure and dismantle old Soviet biological, chemical, and nuclear programs in the old Soviet republics. And they did do some of that. They went to Kazakhstan and other places, and they found anthrax labs. And, the U.S. already has its own anthrax, as we know from the anthrax attacks on U.S. soil that came from the U.S. Army lab. So they don't need, Kazakhstan's anthrax lab. Of course, I believe them. They probably would prefer that lab be dismantled. They actually talk about how they brought it back for safekeeping to the United States to secure it. Sure, they paid the Soviet Republic leaders a lot of money for that. But if that's true, just using common sense, if all these are old, the residue of old Soviet biological and chemical weapons programs, one would assume that Russia would have them, given that Russia was not just part of the Soviet Union, but the epicenter of it, the capital of it. They controlled all those Soviet republics from Moscow. So if that's all it is, you would not worry in any way about Russia getting their hands on it, since by definition, their Soviet programs, Russia would already have it. Then, on top of that, the Russians actually have sophisticated scientists. They were one of the first countries, maybe even the first, depending on how you look at it, what you measure it by, to develop a COVID vaccine. The Sputnik vaccine was declared by Lancet to be safe and effective in mid-January of 2021. And the Americans and NATO went around trying to bully the world not to buy it, telling them it was unsafe. Until very recently, within the last few weeks, the Australians refused to recognize it even as a vaccine at all. If there was a vaccine mandate, very strict one in Australia, and a lot of Australians had family members who were vaccinated with Sputnik, either because they lived in Russia or they lived in a country where Sputnik was disseminated. And in the minds of the Australian government, you were deemed unvaccinated if you got the dirty Russian vaccine. So they did a big campaign against it. But the reality is, they were one of the first to develop it. And of course, there's a long line of impressive Soviet accomplishments in science and technology and leading the exploration of space and all of that. Whereas Ukraine, has very little of that. It's a much smaller country. It's a country that has barely existed for very long as an independent sovereign state. So the idea that Ukrainian scientists have developed important research into pathogens that the Russians wouldn't have is completely, incredible, unless you have the Americans working with them.
There you go.
And I'm not saying that we have proof that there are biological weapons labs in Ukraine, because what Victoria Nuland called them was biological research facilities. But the game that the United States government plays is a semantic one. The United States government does develop biological weapons. There's no doubt about that. As I said, the anthrax attack in 2001, which was terrifying because, as you probably remember, it was said to be this extremely sophisticated weaponized strain. It was the AIM strain. It wasn't the kind of anthrax that's a bacteria that grows in nature. It was manipulated in a laboratory to be turned into a weapon. And that was done at a U.S. Army infectious disease lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland, under the auspices of Dr. Fauci. So we know that they turned common anthrax into a weapon, into a biological weapon that actually killed 5 people when it was unleashed on American soil by a U.S. Army scientist. We also know that they pay the Chinese and also themselves to manipulate various viruses, including the coronavirus. They make them more lethal. They make them more contagious. Once you manipulate them that way and make them more contagious and lethal, by definition, it's a biological weapon. So but they say, when you tell them that, they say, those don't count as biological weapons. Biological weapons under the convention, under the treaty that bans them, only means that you develop the weapon in order to unleash it, in order to deploy it against populations. As long as you're developing these weapons with good motives, with defensive motives, with the intention of studying them in order to develop vaccines against them, then they don't count as biological weapons. So when the U.S. government says, we don't have biological weapons anywhere, we don't have biological weapons in Ukraine, it's only what Victoria Nuland called a biological research facility, it's extremely possible, under the jargon of how the U.S. defines these terms, that there is a biological weapons facility there, but they're going to deny that it's that because there are weapons there, pathogens that have been manipulated and made more lethal, but because they claim they only did it with good motives, whereas the Russians do exactly the same thing but with bad motives, it's the Russians who have biological weapons and not the West.
Boy, the next thing you're going to tell me is they're working on gain of function at the Wuhan virus laboratory. That's what I'm afraid of.
That's a conspiracy theory, according to Fact Check and PolitiFact and USA Today, that you're not allowed to say.
That's a crazy.
Only QAnon believes that.
I mean, people don't remember about that anthrax thing, and that we were actually developing that in Fort Detrick. You know, if you can think of a nefarious kind of biological thing to do, they're doing it. That the Fauci's doing that. I mean,
of course. You think that they believe the Russians have a biological and chemical weapons program, and I'm sure they would say the same about Iran,
right?
Probably North Korea, and yet the United States just no. We refrain. We don't mess with that stuff. We promised in a convention we wouldn't do it. You believe that? Anyone believe that?
They immediately said that when the anthrax attacks, they're like, oh, Saddam Hussein's doing this, and that only he could do it because the chemical that they're using is only coming from Iraq. And do you remember that? Of course, we developed it here in this country.
What they did was, this is one of the big mysteries of the anthrax attacks was, first of all, there are a lot of people who do not believe the FBI's case against that scientist.
Well, he died. Unfortunately,
he killed himself. He killed himself right as they claimed they were about to arrest him.
Damn.
So, unfortunately for the FBI, they never got the opportunity to go into court and present what they insist is this like definitive,
right,
dispositive evidence of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Because unfortunately, he happened to kill himself right as they were about to arrest him. But believe us, the evidence is really strong. But there was a lot of cynicism and doubt in mainstream news outlets and in like the journal Science, various members of Congress and both parties about whether the FBI's evidence was really this dispositive. A lot of people thought it didn't make sense what they had claimed, the story they told about how they knew it was him. I didn't think it made sense at the time I wrote a reporting on it. And 3 years later, in 2011, they made their evidence available to a panel of independent scientists. And the panel of independent scientists came back and said, the FBI's genetic evidence that they were relying upon that they claimed was so dispositive is nowhere near as dispositive as they were claiming. And they went out of their way to say, we're not saying the case is wrong. They said like the evidence that they pointed to is like the proof that you can believe is nowhere near that level of certainty. And what's so weird, Jimmy, is the columnist Richard Cohen in the Washington Post, who was a liberal, the kind of token liberal at the Washington Post, but he supported the Iraq War. He was the one who notoriously said when Colin Powell went to the UN, only a fool or a Frenchman.
Yes, that's it.
Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. In 2004, he wrote an article about why he got that wrong, why he supported the Iraq War. And he said, the reason I supported the Iraq War wasn't because of 9/11, it was because of anthrax. I got convinced that it was Iraq that did it. And I didn't want to let them attack us again, Iraq, meaning Iraq. And he even said that before anyone even knew about anthrax, before the attack happened, people in Washington, he's been in Washington forever, obviously well-connected, told him to carry Cipro, which is the antidote against anthrax. And he was like, why would I carry Cipro? And they said, because there may be an anthrax attack coming. Right when there was the anthrax attack, people were terrified. Sources inside the US government leaked to ABC News what you just said, which is that they did a chemical analysis. They found bentonite, which only Saddam Hussein uses for his anthrax. And that was high indication that it came from Iraq. John McCain went on, millions of Americans watching. It was the first show David Letterman did after 9/11. And the anthrax came from Iraq. ABC News acknowledged that it was a lie. There was no bentonite in the analysis. And even if there were, bentonite is basically, it's like the clay that's used to clump kitty litter. So when your cat poops, like the little, rocks stick together with the poop. That's what makes it effective. It's just common clay. But so bentonite is used in anthrax because you have to, if you want to weaponize anthrax, you have to prevent it from they're very light. You have to prevent them from just like floating away. So you use bentonite to hold them together to make them more potent. So first they blamed Iraq, then they blamed Saddam Hussein, or blamed Al-Qaeda. We never found out who are these people inside the government who said that this bentonite was in the analysis when it wasn't. Obviously, it did play a role in helping Americans support the attack on Iraq. But if you believe the FBI's version, what that means is that these weaponized anthrax came from a U.S. lab and that it was the U.S. government lab that produced it, and an army scientist with the U.S. government that effectively did a false flag attack on U.S. soil. That's not a crazy conspiracy talking. That's the FBI's
That's their
view
theory.
of what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, the fact that anybody would believe anything coming from the government or the corporate press surrounding any of this is shocking to me, because I've lived through Iraq, I've lived through Libya, I've lived through Syria, Venezuela, now
Russiagate.
Russiagate, and 20 years of Afghanistan, which the Afghanistan's papers revealed was nothing more than a transfer of wealth to the military-industrial complex. That's all it was. There was never a mission. They never knew what they were doing. They didn't even know who the enemy was that they were fighting. Hey, we got more dates for our 2022 stand-up tour. We're going everywhere. We're going to Dallas, Houston, Florida. We're going to Omaha, Des Moines, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Ohio, and Los Angeles. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all the tickets for all our shows.